The I.N.S. is the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the huge federal bureaucracy that's been assigned to the front lines in the war against terrorism. On one hand, its job is to screen 350 million foreign visitors who come to the U.S. every year. On the other, to distinguish between the ones who want to visit the Statue of Liberty and the ones who want to blow it up. The reality is that few, if any, federal agencies have a worse track record than the I.N.S. when it comes to mismanagement, corruption, inefficiency, and ineptitude. It's estimated that there are nearly 9 million illegal immigrants living in the United States. They have all eluded the I.N.S., including close to 4 million who came here on temporary visas and never bothered to leave.
This is on good for 90 days.
Simply disappearing into the countryside.
Okay, enjoy your trip.
The I.N.S. doesn't know where they are, or in most cases, who they are. A few weeks ago, the agency finally began sending out agents to look for some of them. Foreign nationals who were ordered to leave the country voluntarily and never did. There are 314,000 of those, 6,000 from countries identified as al-Qaeda strongholds. And those numbers haunt George Terwilliger, who used to oversee the day-to-day operations of the I.N.S.
Do you think the I.N.S. has a handle on who it lets in and who's here?
No.
And whether they've left?
No. No. They don't.
Terwilliger was Deputy Attorney General, the #2 man in the Justice Department when the first George Bush was president.
There are many things they have done very poorly for a variety of reasons, and on balance you'd have to say that the agency just doesn't function to the level that's necessary to do its job.
And this has been going on for some time.
It has. It's been going on for a long time.
That's not just George Terwilliger's opinion. It's one of the worst-kept secrets in Washington. These are just some of the dozens and dozens and dozens of government reports, audits, and congressional testimony criticizing the I.N.S. for inefficiency, corruption, arrogance, ineptitude, and lack of accountability. Neither Republican nor Democratic administrations have been able to fix it.
Let's go! You gotta get out of here! Come on!
The most recent example is September 11th. 3 of the hijackers had violated the terms of their visas and were subject to deportation. 2 were on the CIA terrorist watch list. No one knew where to find them. In fact, it took the I.N.S. more than 2 months just to come up with the files on 6 of the hijackers. Then there was the case of the alleged ringleader, Mohammed Atta. In January of last year, he arrived at Miami International Airport on a flight from Madrid. He was traveling on a tourist visa, although he told I.N.S. agents he intended to take flying lessons. If immigration officials here had been following their own policies, Atta would never have been allowed to enter the United States. First, he'd stayed longer than he was authorized to on his previous visit, making his current visa invalid. Second, he didn't have a student visa, which was required for him to be attending flight school.
He should have been stopped. He should have been turned around.
But you see this sort of thing happening all the time.
Yes, unfortunately I do, yes.
Stanley Mungaray has been an I.N.S. inspector at Miami International for 10 years. He talked to us, without permission from his superiors, about what he called ongoing security lapses. Mungaray told us, and others confirmed, that the I.N.S. computers, which hold the names of known criminals and suspected terrorists, go down on a regular basis, enabling thousands of people to enter the United States without being checked against the government's watch list.
We don't know who we're admitting, and they're getting admitted. We don't know if the person is a criminal. We don't know if he's on the watch list. We don't know anything.
How often did the computers go down?
It's a pretty regular occurrence.
Once or twice a week?
At least.
And during this time, nobody is comparing the people that are coming into the country to the watch list?
There's no way to do it. They don't have any kind of backup system.
This has happened after September 11th?
Yes.
And your supervisors are aware of this?
Yes, in fact, they're telling people, let's keep processing them, keep going.
I do, sir. Thank you.
Michael Bromwich was Inspector General at the Justice Department in the Clinton administration. He spent most of his time on the I.N.S., investigating fraud, corruption, and mismanagement, and trying to make sense of its sprawling data processing system, which is largely unable to communicate with other key federal agencies like the FBI.
It's not one computer system either, it's multiple computer systems, and we found that a tremendous amount of money was being spent, but that the projects were way behind schedule. They were vastly over budget. There was no guarantee that the systems would achieve the objectives that had been set for them.
Next finger.
A classic example is the I.N.S system, an advanced $100 million database that was supposed to track people who were regularly apprehended illegally crossing the border from Mexico. But it didn't help the I.N.S solve one of the biggest border crimes in history. Rafael Resendez-Ramirez was put into the system every time he was caught crossing the border. But what wasn't in the computer was the fact that Resendez was a serial killer wanted by the FBI. And every time the Border Patrol stopped him, it let him go.
He was in I.N.S custody 7 times and released, voluntarily deported, came back. He was in custody 7 times and was found guilty of committing 4 murders after the 7th time he had been released.
California Congressman Elton Gallegly is a senior member of the House Immigration and Claims Subcommittee.
We have increased the budget for I.N.S over the last 8 years 250%, and it's less functional today than it was 8 years ago.
And Congressman Gallegly is not short on examples. Just before the September 11th attacks, he got a call from a U.S. naval base in his district saying that a man using counterfeit documents had been apprehended trying to gain access to the base. Because the intruder was a foreign national, Navy officials had first called the Border Patrol, which told them it couldn't spare anyone to go pick the man up. The I.N.S said it didn't respond to those kinds of calls.
I called the I.N.S and they basically confirmed that's their policy. And I said, for goodness sakes, if you can't protect the integrity of a military installation from people using fraudulent documents to get into highly technical and national security installations, what can you protect?
Gallegly believes the problems at the I.N.S are systemic. In 1995, he led a congressional delegation to inspect the I.N.S's chronically overcrowded Chrome Detention Center in Miami.
We were not down there on a witch hunt, by the way. We're down there trying to find ways to help the I.N.S do a better job if they needed help. But it didn't appear they needed any help. On the way leaving the facility, some man came running out of a crowd to hand me a letter, and I just looked at it to see what it was, and it was like a letter signed by a long list of employees with some very serious allegations.
The allegation, signed by 47 I.N.S employees, laid out a conspiracy to mislead the congressional delegation into believing that the detention center was operating smoothly. Days before their visit, 104 detainees, 25% of the inmate population, were either transferred to other facilities or simply released into the community without medical or criminal background checks. Former Justice Department Inspector General Michael Bromwich confirmed those allegations and more after a year-long investigation.
We found a concerted effort on the part of a significant number of I.N.S personnel, from relatively low-ranking people to relatively high-ranking people, who participated in this effort to paint a false picture to the congressional delegation.
When you say a false picture, you mean deceive?
Yes.
Congress?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But that's not the worst part. After deceiving Congress, Bromwich said the I.N.S proceeded to stonewall the Justice Department investigation.
What we ran up against was a group of very angry, hostile, and uncooperative people from the lower levels up to the very senior levels.
Did you feel like the I.N.S was obstructing your investigation?
I thought, and we found, that a number of people in the I.N.S were acting to obstruct our investigation, yes.
And that's not the worst part either. The Justice Department recommended that Walter Dan Cadman, the district director in Miami, who knew about the deception and was involved in the obstruction, be suspended, terminated, or at least reassigned to a position where he would not have significant managerial responsibilities. Here comes the worst part.
And today he is?
My understanding is that he is back in Washington and in a significant position here.
In fact, he's chief of counterterrorism.
I found that out recently.
I mean, he's running one of the most sensitive positions in the I.N.S.
So I understand.
Cadman's official title is Counter-Terrorism Coordinator. He is the I.N.S. liaison with national security agencies, supervises a staff of 15 people, and is the person at the I.N.S. responsible for tracking and identifying international terrorists who might be trying to enter the United States. Cadman, like everyone else at the I.N.S. that we wanted to speak with, refused our request for an on-camera interview.
How do you really promote a person that can't be trusted, particularly in a job that requires a tremendous amount of sensitivity as it relates to our national security?
This isn't the first time this sort of thing has happened in the I.N.S.
Right.
How do you explain it?
Because there is a history and a well-known environment in which misconduct is frequently not reported, and even when it is reported and investigated, no consequences, no adverse consequences come to the person who engaged in the misconduct. You create a culture in which that is accepted.
And there's no shortage of misconduct. Last year, the Justice Department handled 4,200 allegations of misconduct against I.N.S. personnel. That's one allegation for every 8 employees, ranging all the way from drug smuggling, sexual assault, and murder by Border Patrol agents to ripping off a department store, which is what a woman named Rosemary Slattery did. She happened to be the ethics instructor at the I.N.S. Academy.
It's not a good thing when the people who are teaching ethics courses are stealing. I agree with that.
Former Inspector General Bromwich says the people who are most upset and frustrated about the situation are thousands of hard-working, dedicated I.N.S. employees, many of whom he met while visiting Justice Department offices around the country.
What I found striking was the willingness with which those I.N.S. field personnel openly criticized and indeed were contemptuous of their headquarters and their centralized management. I would tell my colleagues, I'm somebody who oversees this agency. I can't believe they're telling me these things and putting all their warts out there and expressing their dissatisfaction and indeed their contempt with their own agency so openly.
Former Deputy Attorney General George Terwilliger says the time has come to do something about it.
Do you think most people understand how bad the situation is?
I don't know that they fully appreciate how bad the situation is, but I think what they appreciate, and I think frankly what American citizens at large appreciate, is that, like many other things, the immigration situation has changed after 9/11, and that now part of the process of securing the United States and the safety of our citizens from further violence depends on that agency doing the job that we need it to do.
Are they up to the task?
Any candid assessment today, one would have to conclude that they're not up to the task as currently constituted.
To try and fix the I.N.S., the Justice Department is dividing the agency into 2 separate bureaus, one focused on enforcement, the other providing services to legal immigrants. But now a bill in Congress would go much further, abolishing the I.N.S. altogether and starting from scratch with a brand new agency.